Welcome to the program for Women in Engineering, Keynote. My name is Semahat Demir. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Mara Aspinall. Mara is the president and CEO of Ventana Medical Systems and also the global head of Roche Tissue Diagnostics. She will start her new leadership role very soon, so we congratulate her for that. The company Ventana is a $500 million company, an industry leader that creates, designs, and manufactures equipment and supplies for the analysis of cancer biopsies. Mara was most recently founder, president, and CEO of OnQuality, a startup diagnostic company focused on circulating tumor cell technology. Prior to this, she spent 12 years with Genzyme Corporation, where she held senior leadership roles as president of Genzyme Genetics and president of Pharmaceuticals. A frequent industry speaker, she led industry-wide outreach initiatives to better educate the healthcare community and policymakers about genetics, genomics, and personalized medicine. She currently holds an appointment as lecturer in healthcare policy at Harvard Medical School and is a director of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. She co-authored Realizing the Promise of Personalized Medicine in Harvard Business Review and most recently was named one of the 2010 100 Most Inspiring People in Life Sciences by Pharma Voice magazine. She earned her MBA from Harvard Business School and her bachelor's degree in international relations from Tufts University. She is also a fellow of American Institute of Medical and Biological Association. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce her. And the title of her talk is so relevant, so important, and so inspiring. Re-engineering the War on Cancer, a call to action for personalized medicine. Please join me in welcoming Mara.
Thank you. It is great to see all of you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. So, as we said, I'm going to talk about re-engineering the war on cancer, but really about personalized medicine, a term that in many ways is overused, but I'm going to try to describe it and really accurately assess where we are and where we're going. So first, I'm going to talk about that war. What is a battlefield assessment? Then, definition setting, why now? If we've talked about personalized medicine forever, what has changed? When will it really be adopted? So you'll get a sense that I will tell you we're not fully there. And then what is the call to action? So first, let me start with the battlefield assessment. And Svat talked about it. The battlefield, unfortunately, deaths remain stubbornly high, and I will say still unacceptable. Over the last 50 years, we have made tremendous progress in the fight against heart disease, despite of worsening obesity in virtually every piece of the US system. And I'll apologize now, most of the presentation, the data is mostly US based, but the trends are pretty much the same all over the world. The war on cancer, however, since that official declaration of that, we have seen virtually no change. And that's in spite of the US decline in smoking of 50% and around the world decline in smoking of 30%. We have not made enough progress. And the little bit of progress that is made at the end here, I would say it's about early detection rather than new cures. So first piece of battlefield assessment. Second, today's treatments are good, but they're not good enough. Now, there are some great drugs out there, and I'll talk about them in a minute, but unfortunately, if you look across the entire oncology spectrum, drugs work 22% of the time. On average, drugs work 50% of the time. And this was a study done a few years ago, and interestingly, some pharmas, Eli Lilly in particular, are actually presenting this to say we need to spend more money in R&D, and we need to focus on it. Now, it's not that these are bad drugs. I would say they're not being targeted and effectively enough. And that's why the call to action for personalized medicine is so important. So if we stick with the second assessment of the battlefield, what you'd find is even targeted drugs are not efficacious at the 80% level, which the FDA announced 10 years ago should be our objective. Now, you could argue about some of this data. In particular, I will tell you that the Herceptin data is done in all breast cancer patients and was not done on HER2-positive patients. But I have to present the data that's out there. But what you see here is the first stage of personalized medicine has been great, but not great enough. So many of these drugs are ones for which there is a single gene or a single protein that we can identify. But I think the future is more complex. So again, tremendous progress, but not enough. We've got to see that curve change. And in many cities across the country, at least in the US, cancer is the #1 killer versus heart disease. So if that's the assessment of the war on cancer, what are we talking about when we talk about personalized medicine? So first, let's talk about the myth and reality. And many of you who are in engineering but have studied the father of modern medicine, really the father of medicine is mostly in Germany, but we talk about William Osler, based in the US. And the myth as a layperson is that medicine is objective and definitive. It's always right. But he said this much earlier at the beginning of the 20th century, that if it were not for the great variability, medicine might be a science, not an art. And if it is an art, it's the art of probability and the science of uncertainty. And again, each of us has roles as scientists, engineers, physicians, and lay people. We'd like to believe the clarity that science brings us today, that medicine brings us today, but the reality is it is not yet there. So let's talk about definitions. What I call trial and error is the old paradigm. There's an observation, there's a lump in the chest, there's a lump in the breast. The physician looks at that and takes an action. Let's go to chemotherapy and radiation. And then what happens next is an observable response. The challenge is, that's what I call, I guess old-fashioned computer language, a do loop. It goes around and around. And you say, come back after 6 months of chemo, we'll see how it goes, and if not, we'll try another one. I would say this is successful when you learn from it, but it's unsuccessful if this is what you continue to do as the standard of care. In many areas, we don't have a choice, and we have to live with this. The future, I think, is linking tests to action and therapy. Same observation, there's a growth. But instead of moving right to action, there's a test. And I define tests broadly, not about a molecular test or a tissue test or a sequencing test. That some of that test might even be a family history. It's getting the information to take an action. And then, instead of an observable response, we can get a predictable response. Is it perfect? No. But it breaks the cycle of simply trial and error. Why is this so important? It's important because patients don't have time for trial and error. Lung cancer, very prominent. Every one of my aunts and uncles who have passed away have died of lung cancer. And the 1-year survival is 42%. So for my uncle, who had lung cancer, and they refused, if people are familiar, to do an EGFR test to see if Tarceva worked for him. The doctor refused to do it. Indeed, my uncle died of cardiotoxicity from a chemo treatment. And at the funeral, the physician came up to me and said, I'm sorry, I understand now. We should have done the test. Now, I don't know if my uncle was EGFR positive and should have gotten Tarceva, but not getting that information is unacceptable. And I don't want to have to convince people patient by patient by patient. We need to do the education broadly. And the challenge in waiting is that 60% of the patients are not there after the first round of trial and error. Have we had successes? We have. CML, 60% survival in a year. After Gleevec, 93% survival. APL, before ATRA, 40% survival. After ATRA, 90% survival. For cancer patients, as many of you know, unfortunately personally from friends and family, it's a matter of time and getting that much more time for new treatments to be developed. So the idea that trial and error is good enough, I would say, is not good enough. And we have to re-engineer the whole system to be able to deal with it. But when we talk about personalized medicine, it's very easy to say it's all about what drug. If you're HER2 positive, take Herceptin. I would submit it's much more complex than that, and is not just the responsibility of the drug developers, but much broader. So I say that there are actually 6 categories of personalized medicine tests. Yes, the first one, drug selection. But secondly, and I will tell you that I think this is the biggest area now, which is drug dosage. To be able to say that it's not all about weight. Our metabolism, I have an extremely fast metabolism, and as a result, finally, my doctor listened, and I got different drug dosages than my weight would say I need. And I believe you will see many more tests coming out to accurately dose for genetic, well, actually for any type, but many genetic causes. Thirdly, drug efficacy and resistance. Fourth, monitoring and disease status. This is something I'm very familiar with and started a company called Oncuity around circulating tumor cells. This is less about biology and more about biomedical engineering to capture these circulating tumor cells in the blood of patients as these cells are indeed circulating, growing, or dying. That's a type of personalized medicine that we've never had before. You start chemo, you end with that chemo unless you have toxicity. This gives us the ability to actually monitor as we go. Recurrence risk, many of you have heard of a company called Genomic Health and their test to predict the likelihood of recurrence and therefore whether you should have chemo. And lastly, and potentially most controversial, and I think longest to be broadly adopted, is predisposition testing, to test people who are not patients, but normals, to say what is the likelihood of you developing a disease. So as we go forward, when you think about personalized medicine, think about it as a multifactorial issue, not just around which drug do I take. So what's the context here? The context here is it's not just treatment that saves lives, but it's diagnosis that saves lives. And that's a key insight that is really changing the way many pharmaceutical and biotechs look at their development. In addition, the reality in today's world is diagnosis saves money. So you can't have something, unfortunately, I suppose, that only saves lives. It needs to, at the same time, be of an economic benefit to the entire healthcare system. So this sounds great, and I'm talking about the excitement of this, and it's all in the future. Well, not really. I wanted to give you the context of, has this happened before, and what role has diagnostics played to date? And I'm a student of medical history, so I'm going to go back to the 1950s, as we did on the War of Cancer. And if you look back, you can look at infectious disease. We had antibiotics in the 1940s, again, mostly in Germany, and then moving to the US and other parts of North America. But it wasn't until we had the ability to test for bacterial characterization that we could effectively use antibiotics that weren't so broad spectrum. They brought more toxicity than the disease itself. Secondly, blood cancers. I'm going to talk more about this, but it's about the disease characterization of what type of acute or chronic disease you have that allowed us to use the chemotherapy tools that were new to us in the 60s. Heart disease. You say, what biomarkers are here? Blood pressure. Blood pressure is a classic biomarker not broadly used to the 1970s, and that allows us to use statins and other drugs. But probably the best example of diagnostics is viral load and genotyping testing. The first generation of antiretrovirals brought survival from virtually nothing, 2 years, to 7 years for AIDS patients, and then it moved to 25 years and counting, because we have the ability to accurately diagnose, to monitor, and move forward. And what do I think the future is? The future is around solid tumors and what I'll call precision diagnostics, to allow us to much more effectively re-engineer the war on cancer around chemo, radiation, surgery, and other treatments by using diagnostics to get more information than just there's a malignancy here. has this happened? Well, I said I'd talk about blood cancers. I'll go back in history again and talk about these blood cancers. So 100 years ago, if you had night sweats and bruising and anemia and lethargy, the best your doctor could say is you had a disease of the blood. 20 years later, we understood the lymph node system, we understood the bone marrow, and we could differentiate between leukemia and lymphoma. 20 years after that, mostly here in Boston at Dana-Farber, we could differentiate between chronic and acute, all from time of presentation to time of death. And these last 50 years have brought about a tremendous change. We now have 90 plus different types of leukemias and lymphomas. And why is this important? Because I presented this once in Washington, and a payer, I don't want to say bad things about payers because they're not all bad, but somebody raised their hand and said, this is exactly why our health insurance costs so much. This is ridiculous. Who cares whether you have a myeloid leukemia or a lymphoblastic leukemia? I don't care, it's leukemia. Well, we all know that's not the case. But just to look at some numbers, 5-year survival from 0%, and really in the 1940s, 1950s, only 5 to 10%, to more than 70% survival here. So this is the story. And much of the change in cancer survival has come from blood cancers. And I would submit it's because we understand the subcategories of these cancers. It's not about big disease states. It's about multiple small ones. So it sounds rosy. Let me tell you, it's not all rosy. If we look at pancreatic cancer, yeah, we've learned a lot. We now know it's resectable. But what's the sum total of pancreatic cancers that we have today? 7. And many would say, really, it's 2 or 3, and we're stretching it to move it to 7. And as a result, 5-year survival is only 5%. We don't yet understand the subsections of the disease. We haven't personalized it. And I would submit, until we do, we won't have specific enough targets for the drug companies to create powerful drugs. Something in the middle, I gave you the best and the worst. Breast cancer. 250 years ago, or even more than that, it was a disease called by black bile. We originally thought of it as localized. We then thought of it as broad, do radical mastectomies. We then again went back to localized. And today we've got about 24 different categories of breast cancer. And as a result, we've made tremendous progress. Not 0 to 70, but 50 to 85, and continue to make progress. Is it all about the diagnostic? It isn't, but it's that combination of the diagnostic and the therapeutic that give us the information to create the drugs and get the information from the patient to use them. So if that's the definition, why now? We've been talking about this for 10 years. What are the factors? And I'm going to talk about the 10 factors that, starting with 5 negative ones and 5 positive ones, that say why personalized medicine is ripe to change today. First, as I talked about, drug treatments are often ineffective. But it's not just the cost in lives, it's a financial cost as well. This is from Newsweek in looking at various different diseases and the cost in cancer. I don't know why they hadn't published it in the table, but we spend about $50 billion in prescriptions alone, 39 of that, quote, wasted. Now, I'm not going to be naive enough to say we should just stop doing that. First of all, it represents hope, and we need to be out there continuing to learn, but we need that 22%. Oops. Oh, phew. We need that 22% number to go up to be more effective and use the dollars that we're working on best. Drugs are increasingly expensive. I don't expect this to change. It is increasingly expensive to create the drugs that we need. It's not about lowering the cost of the drugs. It's ensuring that each dose and each course of the therapy is indeed effective. But what's putting the pressure on this? It's not just the drug costs, it's the patents. Over the next 5 years, we will have 237 billion, 7 years going back and going forward, 37% of all prescription sales going off patents. And the first people who will comment on this are the generic manufacturers. It's great for them in the short term, but let's be clear, there are no generic manufacturers unless they're innovators. So this is not saying that we can't have innovation. It's saying we need innovation, respect the patent system, let them go off patents, but let's get new effective drugs into the system thereafter. Factor number 4, patients. This is often not recognized outside the industry, and there are many engineering solutions that have come about that are very effective to ensure that patients are actually taking the drugs given to them. This is becoming an increasingly big issue in cancer, where the vast majority of the new drugs coming out are not infused drugs, but they're orals. And to the extent that they have more orals, we need more creative solutions to ensure that patients are indeed taking their drugs, because today we're only at 25% of the time. So you can have a lot of personalization and the right dose, and if a patient doesn't take it, it doesn't work. And number 5 from the bad news category is physician incentives. If you look at physician incentives from a family practice physician to a cardiovascular surgeon, the ones who are much more diagnosis intensive are on the left-hand side of the scale and make, for the most part, less than $200,000. At least the American and really many systems around the world are all about intervention and not about taking the time to diagnose, and as a result, at the high side of the world. Not to say that we don't need both ends of that spectrum, but I would suspect we need to balance the incentives to ensure that physicians have the time and financials to get it done right. So those are the 5 reasons that concern me and that are negative about why now for personalized medicine, but there are some positive ones. The first one here is advances in disease pathway knowledge. And this is an oversimplified chart, but if you look at the research that's happening at many of your institutions and so many other places, pathway knowledge has become one of the key areas of investigation. So it's no longer around symptomology for small molecules, but really understanding the pathway. And how do we know that that has changed? I'm sorry, back. How do we know that's changed? Well, when you look at some of the key observations here, you see that they are translated into the next generation of drugs. We haven't fully figured it out. P53 is a great example where it's been out there for a long time, but how it works on which disease is not clear yet. But we've made tremendous progress. And in doing that, you can see it in what pharma has done. If you look at personalized medicine-related revenues, and this is a conservative look, because there are a number of drugs that I would probably add to this, you can see the tremendous growth of drugs that are now part of a biomarker therapeutic combination. And they continue to rise. And to say that it'll go up 50% is not relevant. But it was only 5 years ago that I was talking about the fact that if it's just Herceptin, we haven't actually made any progress. And it is no longer just Herceptin. Roche continues to be a leader, and just 2 weeks ago got an approval for the malignant melanoma drug with the combination of a V600E test at the same time, and a real fundamental commitment. I think you'll see more and more of that happening. You saw Pfizer's ALK inhibitor drug also come out with a test at the same time. So I think we'll laugh 5 years ago when we see 5 years from now, we see 16 billion. These will be hundreds of billions, if not ultimately, probably in the 10 to 15 year category, the majority of drugs will have tests related to them. How does it look when you look at it from a market share point of view? If you look at the top 7 markets, you'll see about 4% of those drugs indeed have this combination of therapeutic and diagnostic. And lastly, where does cancer stand? Why can I say 10 to 15 years from now it's going to be different? Well, if you look at the pipelines, CA is cancer, the second one over is infectious disease. What you'll see is roughly 1/3 of early stage and slightly more of late stage pipelines indeed have a personalized medicine biomarker with them. Why is the number higher in the late stage than the early stage, which people ask all the time? It's because statistically, if you put a biomarker in and understand the pathway, you have a higher likelihood of success of that program going from phase 1 to phase 3. another benefit for not only the patient, but for the drug developer. How does this work on a real basis? We don't have a lot of time, so I won't go through this, but on the bottom line here is with a drug that indeed has a higher response rate, remember 25 is without the diagnostic, you get a much higher percent of people using the drug time and time again and a much higher return. Number 8, increased government interest. From the FDA to the EMEA and the SFDA, there is fundamental interest, and right now it's a nice to have, not a need to have, but you will see more and more government interest focused on personalized medicine and getting the data with your submission. Number 9, and one that from a diagnostic point of view I think is probably most important, is the diagnostic tools are rapidly improving. In the past, diagnostics were all about macro level testing. Is it cancer or not cancer? Today, it's molecular level testing. We understand a lot more, not just the gross anatomy. But in the future, it's what I would call precision level testing. And it's no longer one gene, one protein, one technology. It's about multiple technology platforms, multiple analytes, regression analysis, new sample types. It's no longer just the tissue, but the blood, the saliva, hair, urine, breath. And you will see a wider variety of non-invasive tests that are coming into the market. And they're widely available to all physicians and patients. So patients are coming with their test to their doctor because they did it online or they did it in their alternative care at the drugstore down the street. So lastly, as I look at what are these factors, the more therapeutics we have, the more diagnostics we have. And as a diagnostic industry, we need to support the therapeutic industry. And as a therapeutic industry, we need to acknowledge the importance of the diagnostic industry. So the two work together in really re-engineering how we think about collaborations. So when will it be adopted? I'm going to say we've got a while left. We don't have time to go through the details of this, but if we were here 5 years from now, we would say, or even today, I believe there are 5 battlefields. We need to make sure the science is ready, that pharma will participate, that physicians will use, that regulations will instill confidence, and that the reimbursement system brings it all together and that people pay. So what does it take to, check mark each of these battlefields and say that we've successful? I think about it as 3 steps. Fear. And just to be honest, anything new is just plain scary. And companies are not immune and regulatory agencies are not immune. They got to get over their fear. Once they do, we acknowledge its value, and then we move to acceptance. And it's only through going through these 2 stages that I believe we will have full acceptance of personalized medicine. What is the fear? We don't have time to go through this, but I wanted to give you some highlights of it. And I'll say, even though I'm a strong proponent of personalized medicine, these are all very legitimate fears. Payers saying, oh, personalized medicine is great. We're just going to spend more money and have no better return. Why is that important? One of the national payers did a survey and found that 19% of Herceptin prescriptions were written at the same time as the test was written. So physicians were saying, oh, they tell me I need to do a test. I'm still going to give you the drug. That's not real personalized medicine. That's checking the box for the sake of doing it. Legitimate fears are out there. We've got to conquer those fears before we can get true change. Some of that's going to happen, in personal interaction. Some of it's going to happen with better products. But don't forget or, wave your hand to say these fears are irrelevant because you don't have them. And lastly, the call to action. I believe that the future is changing. And if we look at diagnostics in particular, we have seen for much of 40 out of the last 50 years a stable base of technology. It has not changed. Now, many new technologies and no longer one-by-one usage. 2, morphology is molecular plus morphology. Single genes, no longer. Tissue samples, multiple types. Time frame is controlled by the pathologist. We are finding that is tremendously changing, and now it's up to the oncologist and the rest of the care team. And it's no longer about one person in the path lab getting it right. It's about that full team going out and quickly moving it forward. What do we need to do? I won't go through these in detail, but just to say, I think it's four areas. Physician education, to make sure they know how to understand how to use these new tools. Secondly, getting data into the records, into the EHR, into the EMR. It is not going to be possible as these systems and the government support for these systems happen without having that data in there. Third, process, using any way to integrate into the MD practice. There may be physicians in the room, wonderful people, but they're not very flexible in terms of changing their regimen. Any new products, new services needs to fit into their regimen as opposed to believing it's going to change in a dramatic way. And lastly, I believe on policy, we need to change the policy on regulation and reimbursement and create what I believe most importantly is a separate center at the FDA for diagnostics that gives diagnostics the confidence and the focus that it deserves as an industry. I know we're running behind in time, so I'm just going to go to the end here, and to say that I see a new world in the future, and the world today starts with the fact that it's very much what I call organ-based treatment paradigms. So if you look at cancer, if you have a brain cancer, if you have a colon cancer, you're seen by very different specialists than if you have a breast cancer or lung cancer. It's all about location. And you remember I talked about the old technology of diagnostics was all about disease or not disease. If you saw a tumor in the breast, it was breast cancer. We know that's not true anymore. So the future is turning this on its head and re-engineering and saying it's not based on organs anymore. It's based on mechanisms. So it doesn't matter if it's lung cancer or colon cancer. It matters whether it's P53 or JAK2 or KRAS. And that's going to be the area of specialties that changes the way we look at it. You can see it's already beginning to happen at many of the most advanced research centers in academia and in industry to say it's that mechanism that makes the difference. And if we bring that all together, we can truly think about cancer in a much more aggressive and integrated with diagnostics and personalized way. What does that mean for our healthcare spending? Well, today, this is what we do. We spend very little when people are young and healthy, and we spend a lot when we're all older and sicker. What personalized medicine means is we spend money across the board, but we spend less money in total. And the challenge will be how to invest in diagnostics and prevention early to get the savings in financial and in quality of life later. And the politics of this, I recognize, is not easy. But as individuals, we can start seeing better products here to help with here. And the challenge we will all have in individual companies, societies, and our major governmental bodies is deciding where those arrows start so we can indeed make personalized medicine, initially for cancer and then for all diseases, truly a success story. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
Thank you, Mara. Can you all hear me? Is it? Okay. Thank you. We have some time for questions. Actually, this is an extended session. We will have some networking opportunity a little bit later. So I'll be the person who will be microphone. Yes.
say, a breast ovarian cancer BRCA 1 or 2 type situation.
So in case you didn't hear the beginning of the question is, am I suggesting testing, gene testing early, a 30-year-old, or some have even asked a 5-year-old, and what are the implications of finding diseases or the high proclivity for an individual disease? Today, I am not personally saying that's necessary. I would say that I believe that the science is still a little bit early for doing that, and the justification and the education needed in our broad population is not quite there. That being said, I think for people in high-risk groups, whether that's done through family history or otherwise, yes, I would suggest that at an age that's very individual by family, that people do know their relative risk profiles and can take proactive actions to avoid the disease itself, with the exception of a few very difficult diseases. For many of the cancers, it is indeed just a proclivity. It is not indeed something that is for sure. And I think that there are many actions that can be taken proactively, including with diabetes, to reduce the likelihood of disease or to reduce the severity of disease. The implications of this, GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, passed after a huge amount of controversy 2 years ago, should protect people from any discrimination in the workplace or otherwise by saying that I happen to have the BRCA gene. You can still get insurance and you can't be discriminated against. I'm not naive. Maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't, but there have been very few lawsuits and very few complaints that have come up since the passage of GINA.
Yeah, I truly believe this is the future of cancer therapy. I see one barrier that may be a major one that you didn't mention, but perhaps you listed under physician education, and that is that we've got to figure out ways to help the physician. Right now, it's lucky if they can have a chance to look at one number in one diagnostic test, and we're now looking at the possibility of huge panels of the tests. And we're going to have to think about software systems, expert systems that are going to be able to distill all of this information and come out with an answer. And then you're going to have to convince the physicians, and this is a cultural change, to believe that expert system. And I think that's going to be a major challenge, as well as all of the other things that you're putting forward here today.
I think that's absolutely right. Can we unlock this? So if you don't mind, because of the expanded session, I completely agree. And I think that we need to start, if you don't mind, I'll answer this from a slide. We need to start with medical education. As recently as 8 years ago, 15% of medical schools had no genetics, no diagnostic education. So we've got to start early. Secondly, I've called for publicly required education for CMEs and boarding exams to focus on diagnosis. The whole purpose of continuing medical education is things that exist now that didn't exist when one was in medical school. A lot of resistance. Thirdly, aggressive issuance of guidelines. Some of the diagnostics industry people are a little defensive about this. I will say I am not. If it's a lousy test, then have the guidelines say don't use it. If you believe in what you do, get it out there and take the risk that people make choices on it. Smart systems, I think, is absolutely right, and I will include it in there. The Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic have put in systems now that are suggestive, not required. So if you want to do a Herceptin prescription, as you put it in, it says, have you done the test? Now, today, if you say no, or warfarin or others, if you say no, it still allows you to prescribe. The future, I think, is going to say, no, you can't prescribe. But many physician leaders are not ready to tell their colleagues that it's going to be a top-down approach. So I can't fix that, but I think that'll be the change. And it may be that it comes because of the payers. Kaiser is doing some systems like that with their physicians and saying, these are our guidelines, and that diagnostics is going to become the new pre-authorization. And I suspect that may drive physician education more than any of these other things.
I like the slide where you have all these different pathways for this.
Yeah.
With your slide where you say, okay, first we thought it is cancer, now we have so many different types, and we even start to think about different types of, or different disease classes behind this. So how would you see really this in the future? So if we block one pathway, then obviously things are coming back. Biology is very smart. So would you then see that we would have more complex integrated tests of all pathway families, or is it really this dedicated, what is pathway, the one and only?
I think that, I mean, you know it better than I do, but I think you're absolutely right that the pathway piece is not simple. And this slide sort of simplifies it, that we've figured out pathways. I think it will be a series of more complex tests. And that series of more complex tests will often have forks in the road, where that you will have reflex testing only if you're going down this pathway versus this pathway. I also believe that what we've learned about pathways is they change over time, just like we found out in AIDS, as there could be a primary pathway and a primary virus that's taking over, and then it changes over time with the use of a medication. So I see that diagnosis no longer becomes something at the very beginning and often at the very end, but rather something that's continuous around monitoring. But that the initial workup is indeed complex, and then it may be then just a relatively simple test along the way to see if that pathway is still indeed the correct one.
I'm going to take this because there's something.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's, it covers really all the aspects, and you saying it will take a while to get there. I think 15 years is too optimistic, but I would have many questions to discuss all afternoon, but maybe address only two. So what you just said about the pathways is I think a major thing in cancer, where you give like a drug and 2 years later you need to give a different drug because things changed. With that respect, how important do you think pharmacogenomic studies are, and the time it will take to get the patient population together to do these? And the other question I have is, can you elaborate on how important interdisciplinary research is in that field? Because there's been a lot of sequencing being done in cancer, and there's a lot of data, and people look at it and everyone is fairly disappointed that they don't find that gene that's responsible for that cancer. And all the multivariate analysis, I mean, there's a lot to be done. And you know, it needs some engineers, computer scientists, bioinformaticians to work on it, but often they are not very well funded.
Yeah. Well, we might have all afternoon to discuss those, but I'm going to be very quick. First, on pharmacogenetic studies, I think they're absolutely essential. You know, when I show that picture of changing the hospital from breast cancer to HER2-based cancers, you know, I close my eyes and I sound a little bit naive if I say this, or optimistic. But what if drugs were approved based on their mechanism of action, not on the disease at all? So you would know what are the 4 pathways that are relevant to a particular drug, and then not worry about getting enough breast cancer or lung cancer or other patients in the trial, just getting EGFR positive patients into the trial. I think that it would not only accelerate research, it would accelerate use of the drugs with patients, which is what it's all about. So I think those studies cannot be underestimated. I do, however, believe, and I get into policy here, that payers need to work with pharmaceutical companies to provide more safety nets for patients to go into clinical trials. Less than 5% of patients go into clinical trials, but in 35 states, I believe, if you go into a trial and you can't stay in that trial, or there's a problem in the trial, that, you know, for whatever reason the trial ends, you can't go back to the basic treatment. That's unacceptable. It's not true in Massachusetts, but we needed legislation to change that. So we need to work as a healthcare industry to encourage people to go into trials and really understand why they're not in trials. And I don't believe it's about informed consent complexity. People are very smart when it comes to their own health. So strong. I make that policy announcement, not for any company, but just for me. In terms of how do we get the research funded, I didn't quite hear your issue there, but I think that's the reason that I think we need a separate center at the FDA. I've named it, called CADR, the Center for Advanced Diagnostics Evaluation and Research, because we need to acknowledge diagnostics as a separate field in and of itself. In the same way, the radiologists have done a brilliant job in re-engineering radiology, even after new advances threatened their profession, and they've, you know, sort of brought it up a notch. So I think funding will come if we recognize that diagnostics is a separate field, not an outgrowth of some other field, and therefore an area for which students and more advanced professionals will focus.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Well, if not, first I would like to congratulate Mara for her new leadership role at Ventana Medical Systems. And also we'd like to thank you for this inspiring talk on personalized medicine. Thank you very much, and let's applaud for her.